So, in the patriarchal texts of which the novel is largely composed, not entirely, um, I'm gonna, examine a crucial exception to this. Um, but largely, the novel builds tension between this patriarchal perspective and the bodies that it excludes, um, the embodied experience that it excludes. So you might think of this, Frankenstein versus the creature. The creature as Frankenstein is precisely how the creature's experiences erased and disregarded. You can also think of this as the law of the father versus the maternal labor of poetic nesting, that is, say, empathetic reading the text, reading the embodiment disguised in the text, disguised, also in the form of the reader herself, as an excluded body entailed by the text, involved by the text. She's, after all, the addressee of all the text. She's the reason for the text. Is a embodied female. Um, um, so I can't get over this. I think it there's something representative here of the experience of reading Frankenstein. And I mean, memes in general, I think what I'm saying about this applies to memes in general, that they have to do with the recognition of the body, like these bodily embodied expressions, the face you make. So it's it's not just about getting annoyed that somebody's saying your name wrong. It's about an embodied reaction to it, an expression, a gesture, an embodied gesture, um, re, re, um, as a response to that isn't reducible to language. I mean, it has to do with an exclusion of the body from language. Um, uh, and that's, I think, part of what memes, the appeal of memes is that they apply to this embodied intuition, an intuition of emotion, or embodied experience that can't be entirely spelled out in language. It's a way of communicating about the body. Um, and this is part of what's at stake here in the correlation of the reader of the novel with female embodiment, um, and a correlation of the creature, creature analogously as a disregarded body, is the pains of childbirth that I mentioned before. The idea of the body, especially the female body, not just disregarded in the I don't know, orthodox story of the creation in Christianity, but deservedly so by law, as a kind of punishment. Um, I think that's the book is like a metaphor for that. I mean, the disregard and the suffering of the creature is the pains of childbirth. Um, the book is about reproduction, and the embodied costs of reproduction, and it's about men displacing those costs onto women and onto the creature. Um, um, so I talked earlier about a contrast or alternative to patriarchal narrative, and one uh, um, version of that in the novel is what it would have been called in the terms of the time the sentimental education of the creature. That's to say, the emotional education. Um, that's it's interesting to think how it's kind of a novel thing for us to talk about emotional intelligence, emotional learning. But that was a very established thing for the Romantics. Sentimental education meant emotional learning, education of the senses, education through the senses, and Mary Shelley, interactive education, learning about the world through embodied interactive experience. And Mary Shelley takes us through the creature's sentimental education in a pretty, overt, explicit, schematic way. We see these different stages of sentimental development laid out and then integrated into this, or not integrated, as the case may be, into this tradition of male rivalry and patriarchal, this patriarchal tradition. So, what does the creature's sentimental education involve? The primary aim of objective perception isn't objective knowledge. The experience of the senses. Our senses are not there for the sake of knowing the world, primarily, but self-reflection. They're about finding ourself in the environment. Self-reflection is a dynamic, interactive, sublime experience. The sublime is a means of communicating oneself, building oneself a home, or nesting. From the very beginning, a kind of aesthetics of the sublime, the sublimity of nature, is integral to the creature's education. So, she's talking about the infantile education here, and she's saying from the beginning, it's not about objective knowledge, but this interactive practice of sensuous, playful interaction with a sublime nature. That's to say, a nature that defies complete knowledge, that's infinite, but that we can acquire partial, relative, interactive competence. So let's see how this gets narrated. The creature begins here, chapter 11, to retelling his perspective on his birth. So he's run out into the woods, and it's kind of waking up. No distinct ideas occupied my mind. All was confused. I felt light and hunger and thirst and darkness. Innumerable sounds rang in my ears, and on all sides various scents saluted me. The only object that I could distinguish was the bright moon, and I fixed my eyes on that with pleasure. So what do you think about that? On the one hand, she's evoking this kind of chaos, sensuous chaos, of the newborn infant, just kind of overwhelmed with this blur of sense data, unable to categorize it, disaggregate it, and organize it into meaningful experience. But there's something comforting about the moon, just looking at the moon. Why is that? The world is disorienting, but there's something comforting about just gazing upon the moon. I think it has to do with um, self-reflection, self-awareness, consciousness. The moon, the light of the moon, it's an image of reflected light. It's an image of reflection. It so looking at the moon is it's sort of an image of one's own mind, an image of one's self-consciousness, insofar as it's an image of reflected light. Talking about beauty, the experience of beauty earlier is a subjective experience, not an objective property. So when you say something's beautiful, it's about reporting on how it makes you feel. And I think that's a lot of what aesthetic experience is. It's a kind of pleasure, but it's not like the pleasure of eating or sexual pleasure. It's not a pleasure and conquest. On the contrary, there's no conquest. It keeps the object at a distance. But it's a pleasure in this absence or this distance. You remember I was talking about the role of distance in the experience of beauty. Something's at a distance, but it can serve as a means of communicating about ourselves and what makes us feel at home. I mean, again, it's just an image of reflection, and all that's getting communicated in a way is the feeling of communicability. That paradox is been traditionally been used to define the beautiful. It's like as if it had a meaning or value. It seems like it should, but it doesn't. But that's the communicability of that is the fact that I feel like someone else would recognize the feeling that I'm having, this feeling of communicability without content, the form of shareability without meaningful content. So it's as if it had a purpose, as if it had a meaning, as if this could be shared. These imaginary, absent values, the feeling of being able to share those absent values is, it's like birdsong. It's wasted, purposeless pleasure. But it's how we communicate to each other about who we are, is through that waste, that lack of purpose or meaning. So I think it's an image of just feeling at home, like a place that he can look in the environment and feel like a sense of belonging. Another way to think about the moon, what's going on in the pleasure the creature takes in looking at the moon, is what was described early from the beginning in Walton's narrative: eyes that would look into mine, eyes that would reply to mine. It's a sense of the environment replying to me, like offering me an image of familiarity, recognizability, mutual recognition. And that's what he finds something similar in the bird song that he hears. It's an image of community, communication, dialogue, and it delights him at first until he realizes he can't participate. I tried to imitate the pleasant songs of the birds, but was unable. I wished to express my sensations in my own mode, but the uncouth and inarticulate sounds which broke from me frightened me into silence again. So we see him, he's scaring himself, like he scared Victor. The lack of community makes him frightening to himself. this indicates his the desire for an environmental response. He sees a kind of reflection, but he wants a dialogue, a community. And that's something this interactivity is the next thing he learns about the environment. Things aren't one thing or another, but are always defined by relationships. Everything is essentially interactive. One day I was oppressed by cold. I found a fire which had been left by some wandering beggars and was overcome with delight at the warmth I experienced from it. In my joy, I thrust my hand into the embers, but quickly drew it out again with a cry of pain. How strange, I thought, that the same cause could produce such opposite effects. This is a very basic, powerful truth that he's learning here, and fittingly, it has to do with fire, the Promethean element, and it's continuous. It's building on this, same idea that there is nothing essential in itself, but only it is what it is in virtue of the way in which it's situated and related to things around it. So fire is good at a certain distance, but not at another. Finally, the creature learns sort of the metaphorical aspect of fire, that the world, that love rules the world. So, like the fire of the sun, the world, how his own experience is organized, how his comfort in looking at the moon, and the way all his sensuous experience is organized is an expression of love on some level, expression of desire, and the fire, the sun, is a metaphor for that. Looking at the moon, it's sort of the generosity of the sun that provides for the reflected light of the moon, and my witnessing it is, and participating in that generosity somehow. So the world's interrelatedness is an expression of desire, the force of nature, life, God. It's too complex to know, but must be imagined and performed. So that's what we do in our world, our understanding. We're interacting with the world, expressing our desire, offering our love in our representations and communications about the world. This is one of the most crucial scenes in the novel, and number of things to say about it. One is that, it's remarkably novelistic. So he's voyeuristically observing this domestic scene, and learning about family life that way, learning about domestic affection. Remember what Shelley referred to in the preface. And that's what we do when we read a novel, is voyeuristically, spy on the domestic lives, the intimate lives of other people, imaginary characters. So there's, profound analogy plays out here between the reader and the creature. And he's learning about love, and in a way he's getting burned by love. He's getting kind of too close to that fire, in a way that's I think, poignantly juxtaposed to his experience with the actual fire. Um, so he looks through this chink in the wall, and in one corner, near a small fire, sat an old man, leaning his head on his hands in a disconsolate attitude. The young girl was occupied in arranging the cottage, but presently she took something out of a drawer which employed her hands, and she sat down beside the old man, who, taking up an instrument, began to play and to produce sounds sweeter than the voice of the thrush or the nightingale. So he's referring back to that image he's already discovered of communication, of community, um, of the birds that he desired to participate in. But here is something even more beautiful, and he pointedly, compares it. So this is an image of human community. Um, uh, and it's an image of art, again, that's what, and also that's what we're um, participating in by reading the novel. So again, it has this self-reflect. He is bearing witness to what we're doing in the act of reading. It was a lovely sight even to me, poor wretch, who had never beheld aught beautiful before. The silver hair and benevolent countenance of the aged cottager won my reverence, while the gentle manners of the girl enticed my love. He played a sweet, mournful air, which I perceived drew tears from the eyes of his amiable companion, of which the old man took no notice until she sobbed audibly. He then pronounced a few sounds, and the fair creature, leaving her work, knelt at his feet. He raised her and smiled with such kindness and affection that I felt sensations of a peculiar and overpowering nature. They were a mixture of pain and pleasure, such as I had never before experienced, either from hunger or cold, warmth or food, and I withdrew from the window, unable to bear these emotions. So the spectacle of love is more intense than fire. It is unbearable in a way he had never experienced before. And this is the sublime, the defies conceptual containment. It's a blur of contradictory, it's an overpowering, contradictory experience of pain and pleasure. But it reveals what human bonds, family bonds, intimate bonds, social bonds are about. This is, of course, an image of the paternal embrace that the creature never received when it was born. But more generally than that, it's an image of sentimental education. It's how we learn, how we gain emotional intelligence, how we learn about emotional life is through watching or reading about the emotional lives of others. We read the monster's emotion growing and defining itself through how he reads the emotional life of the cottagers. Remember that I remember talking about the philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein and his observation about how we identify emotions, that emotions finally don't have proper objective definitions, that they're more performatively defined. We can only at a certain point, that's what anger is. That's what joy is. That's what grief is. This is what um, parental affection is. Um, so we, this kind of reading is built into our experience of emotion. Um, Part of what emotion is, as opposed to just random acting out, an articulated emotion. I know a feeling of sadness, a feeling um, of love or whatever. Um, that self-aware, that emotional self-awareness comes from this kind of reading is integral to the experience of the emotion. As in Wordsworth, the overpowering feeling can't be faced directly. Or it's hard to communicate directly. Um, uh, but we approach it through this kind of formal recollection or reflection. Um, we, I mean, if you think about it, like, be one thing just to narrate the scene of the cottagers together. But instead, Shelley narrates the scene of the creature watching them. So we see him seeing them. We see the emotion of the scene recollected or reflected in him. That formal, layer of distance, I think, like Wordsworth said, this sort of recollection in tranquility, it allows us to this mediation allows us to conceive of emotional intensities in a way that might be harder to recognize directly. We can see him being overpowered by it, and so we can imagine what the thing might be that he was overpowered by, even if we couldn't see it or say it, face it directly, or articulate it directly ourselves. He transmits the feeling of being overwhelmed, which is just what the sublime is. That's what the sublime means. Not representing the overwhelming object directly, but representing instead, evoking its unrepresentability. It's the fact that the way in which language breaks down or is overwhelms in the way it does for the monster here. So, and that's important because it leads into the next point that the monster learns, which is that we feel first. It's kind of like the point about music preceded language. Also, feeling precedes knowledge. We feel relationships, we feel emotions before we know how to give them the proper names. We learn dialectically the form, feeling, and function of things before we learn objective knowledge, legal names. So it's only after he's gone through this rich series of increasingly intense emotional instruction that he learns how to name what he's been feeling all this time. So the novel plays a little with time. He's telling us, about the infant's experience. He's narrating retrospectively after he learned the words about his experience before he had the words to say it. So later, just in the next chapter, he says, by great application, I discovered the names that were given to some of the most familiar objects of discourse. I learned the words fire, milk, bread, wood. I learned the names of the cottagers, the youth and his companion. Um, the old man had only one name, which was father. The girl was called sister, and the youth brother and son. So he felt what family bonds were before he learned the names for family bonds. He felt what nesting, this the web or nest of uh, family bonds, human community, um, as an emotional experience. Um, before it became nameable or conceptualizable. So the sublime is integral to our sentimental education from the stage of an infant. Um, like Matt Damon in The Bourne Identity, we always come late to ourselves. Our ability to name and understand always follows um, what we've learned in what we know in a preconceptual way, um, and that is often distorted. That's probably what That's what I've been emphasizing here, is how our understanding can often distort um, uh, what we know, our rather embodied experience. um, and that's um, again, that's something that reading the novel is kind of teaching us, how much narratives, these patriarchal narratives, can leave out and distort of the actual experience of bodies. Um, so I want to show you a fantastic little the beginning part of a movie called Enduring Love. Um, and because I think it's a great example sort of what the creature just went through, what we just went through, reading about the creature, reading about love, or witnessing a spectacle of love. So this scene, I think, juxtaposes uh, different images of love, uh, and it begins with a rather mechanical one. It's sort of we see a couple sit down on a lovely countryside and lay out a picnic blanket, and it seems like the stage is being set, even in a kind of forced way, for maybe a marriage proposal. Um, and that kind of controlled mechanism, implicitly patriarchal control, is juxtaposed with images of other kinds of uncontrolled images of love that follow. Um, and I don't want to say any more about it, because it is about this experience of interactivity with the environment. It's about learning through being out of control. Um, and but I want you to think about symbolism. Um, what's the most obvious and kind of trite symbol of love is like a big red heart. Um, okay, check this out.
this, bud. What's your name?
Harry.
We're gonna get out. His name was John Logan.
So, like the scene that the monster witnesses of the cottage, performance of music, um, what a scene like that teaches us, what did you learn from that? Did you learn anything you didn't already know about love? That it involves sacrifice or devotion. It can be allegorized by metaphors like getting swept off your feet or falling in love. It doesn't add anything to your understanding of love, but it's a physical experience. It puts you through, like music. It's a physical experience. It depicts bodies in motion, bodies in emotion, bodies feeling the compulsion of love, and bodies feeling the confusion of love, that mixture, that sublime mixture of pleasure and pain, the strangeness, the unpredictability. The music that's played when there's a lot of noise in that scene. All the chaos is they're grappling with the balloon, but then once they start getting lifted up, there's this beautiful, it's sort of aching achingly sad but beautiful music, sublime kind of uh, atmospheric music that kicks in there. Um, and it's a beautiful scene. It's beautiful. It's also kind of, again, self-mocking a little bit, because it's sort of so explicit in the symbolism of the kind of big red heart in the sky. But again, I think that's a informative irony. It's sort of saying there's not much you can say about love. Like, it's just this crazy compulsion. But that again, that's the sublime thing, is like it's our failure to be able to understand it that is integral to what it is. Our failure to rationalize it, um, that is its defining quality, is it that we can't define or rationalize it. That's what makes love what it is. I mean, this crazy devotion, that's literally, what love is about. This kind of devotion that, if it had a reason to it, wouldn't be what, love is. If we could rationalize it. This uh, scene is, it also involves nature in a really cool way. The wind, is as sort of a image of chaos, unpredictability, um, and uh, it again, it has a kind of surreal aspect to it. There's a moment where, um, before this gust of wind comes in, like we see this, there's sort of a swooping camera, as if from the wind's perspective, um, coming in, swooping in, like a god, or like, Cupid's arrow. Um, uh, and so it's using sensuous experience to teach us about emotional life. It's using the complexity of the natural world to try to tell us and put us through the emotional motions in the same way music does. Um, underscoring its sublime unknowability. Um, another wild aspect. I mean, and it's like the Frankenstein thing, in that it's suspected. We see um, people. We initially see the picnickers acting out a kind of forced love ritual. Seems like, and then that gets replaced by the spontaneous performance of love. But then they turn into spectators of a kind of a sublime performance of love themselves. So we see them seeing, the camera really lingers on them watching, um, uh, and uh, it, underscoring this, just the strangeness of love, this romantic, theme, like Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner. Like, it's love is quite like this scene also, in that it's a juxtaposition of a kind of institutionalized, mechanized convention of love. The man sort of forcing this proposal ritual. Just like in the Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner, we have the wedding ritual, kind of mechanized, conventional performance of love that's juxtaposed to this compulsive, kind of painful, but also ultimately sublimely beautiful experience of hearing the mariner's tale. And like the mariner's tale, this I mean, it's obviously, sublimely strange, but you might not notice just how strange it is. The guy that holds onto the rope and falls to his death isn't his grandfather. He's a guy, random stranger that just drives by in the car. Um, so I think that's very romantic, very much like for the Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner, picking a stranger. Love isn't about any kind, can't be reduced to understandable terms. It really, wants to teach us about some kind of much more radical experience of compassion and devotion. I mean, just like the Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner, it's about feeling the deepest kind of devotion to the most alien stranger. Um, and so is Frankenstein. Um, it's really what it's about.